My name is Trenton Marsalik, and I'm the Special Advisor for the International Diplomacy Initiative, and will be the moderator for today's discussion. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Mr. Tal Zellinger, the founder and president of the International Diplomacy Initiative, to make his opening remarks. Tal?
Dear participants, I welcome you all to our third global event. First, I want to thank His Excellency, Ambassador Robert Rae, for finding the time to speak to us. I cannot express in words how much we appreciate it. The International Diplomacy Initiative was founded just 5 months ago, and look what we have achieved in that 5 months. We have a cooperation with different organizations worldwide. We started to operate in Israel, Germany, the United States, Italy, and India, with more chapters to come soon in different countries. I don't want to take more of your time. I wish to see you all at our coming events. Make sure to keep in touch with us in the different platforms and join our local chapters for more events and programs. Thank you, Trenton.
Okay, thank you very much, Tal. So next up is our keynote speaker, Bob Rae, Ambassador of Canada to the United Nations. Ambassador Rae has extensive experience in diplomacy and politics, serving as Canada's Special Envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues prior to his appointment at his current post. In addition, Ambassador Rae is the former Premier of Ontario and former interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He was elected 11 times to federal and provincial parliaments between 1978 and 2013. Ambassador Rae, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just let me assure you, I'm not drinking wine at lunch. It's whatever you may have heard of diplomacy, this is a Diet Coke. But thank you all. It's very good to meet you all. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to chat with you and answer your questions. I thought that I would just share a few reflections in terms of my own work and how I got into doing what I do now and what the work is really all about. I think it's fair to say that I probably we came into this world through my upbringing. My father was a diplomat, so he joined the Canadian Public Service in 1940 when the war broke out, and the Second World War. He was a young university graduate and had spent time studying in the UK as well as in Canada, and met my mother in the UK. She's born in England, and they had a career together, life together in the Canadian Foreign Service from 1940 to 1980. And during that time, I was born and spent my childhood partly in the US, in Washington, partly in Geneva at the UN, where my father was the ambassador in Geneva. And then I went back to Canada to go to university. And my father went on to serve in Mexico and later at the UN in New York. So I think it's fair to say I grew up in this life. But like a lot of students in the 60s, I said, well, I want to do something different. So I became a labor lawyer. I worked for trade unions and got elected to Parliament when I was very young, at 29, and stayed as a member for a while. And then I became the provincial leader of our political party, that time the New Democratic Party, and eventually became Premier of Ontario, and then was defeated. Went into law. When I went into law in my late 40s, I started doing more international work. I helped to start up a little foundation called the Forum of Federations. I did a lot of work in international mediation as a result of that. Spent more time reflecting on Canada's diplomatic situation, because that was as I said, it was a lifelong interest of mine. And then I decided to get back into politics and became an MP again after having been out for more than a decade. And finally, when I left politics for the second time, this time voluntarily in 2013, I went back to a different kind of law practice, which was looking at human rights and Indigenous issues in Canada, but not only in Canada, sort of around the world, and it became very involved in some human rights issues. I was asked by the Prime Minister to respond for him to the Rohingya crisis, the crisis of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, and then was asked to do another report for him on the impact of COVID on humanitarian and refugee issues globally. And then he asked me to become the ambassador here, which was frankly a surprise. It was not something I was either campaigning for or expecting, but it's what happened. So now I've come full circle. And I thought what I might do at the beginning is really try and talk about a few things that kind of animate the world that we're in today, and really make it, I think, important for us to grasp how challenging things are. First of all, in terms of the Rohingya crisis, that reintroduced me, if you like, to the reality of the relationship between conflict and the current humanitarian crises we see in many different parts of the world. Ironically, there are not humanitarian causes to the humanitarian crisis. There are political causes, economic causes, and other causes to the current humanitarian crisis. And I think that working with the Rohingya people was really a way for me to better understand and appreciate how quickly things can change in people's lives, how one can go from a situation of relative, even if it's oppressive, but still relative stability, to a situation of displacement, of just saying, like, I can't possibly stay here. There's too much conflict around me, or I'm being physically displaced. I'm being pushed out. And there are now about 1 million Rohingya people living in Myanmar and living in Bangladesh, and about 500,000 still living in Myanmar. And the origin of that conflict has to do with citizenship, identity, ethnic conflict, ethnic nationalism, and how the departure of the British really gave rise to the extent of this crisis. And so I think one of the major things we need to understand is that when we look at the extent of the crisis of displacement of not only refugees, but also people who are internally displaced, which is a very significant global problem involving over 100 million people, we really have to understand better the nature of the global response to this situation, and understand how inadequate and how difficult it is, but also how you have to look at the underneath the reasons why people are being forced out, people are being forced to move, people are being forcibly displaced, and try to galvanize and mobilize international institutions and neighboring countries and all those people who are involved in the dispute to try to get at the origins of the conflict and to deal with it. And I would say that in many cases we've not been successful. If you look now, in the last week, of course, we're preoccupied with the events in Gaza and in Israel. The original conflict, if you like, was equally, could be said to be not the product of empire, but the consequence of a stabilizing force in place, which after the British left was gone, And then it became a question of, well, how to resolve the conflict. Was not able to be resolved successfully in 47, when the United Nations says two states for two peoples. And that was rejected by the Arab nations, who disputed the legitimacy of the Jewish presence at all in the Middle East, and certainly in terms of their sovereignty in what was then Palestine, and the failure of the global community to address the underlying issues and to successfully resolve them, to the point where we've got a refugee situation which has lasted now for 75 years, and an ongoing conflict which still has found no successful or enduring resolution, as a result of which every once in a while we end up with these serious conflicts that we had the last few weeks. But looking beyond the Middle East, we see crises, and obviously looking beyond Israel-Palestine, crises in Syria, again, clearly originating in conflict, failure of the global community to resolve or deal with the causes of the conflict, and then the massive displacement which take place then, similarly in Iraq, similarly in Afghanistan. You go around the world and you look at where are the places where there have been these enduring conflicts and the consequences of them. And again, you have to deal with the human impact, because not only are you dealing with a conflict between combatants, between armies, which was the old definition of war, but now increasingly we're dealing with conflicts within countries in which civilians are directly involved and directly implicated. The vast majority of those killed in the conflict in Gaza recently were people either civilians living in Gaza or civilians living in Israel or in the West Bank. And so you then have to appreciate that this is one of the significant differences in warfare which has taken place over the last 100 years in terms of the numbers of civilians who are implicated in the conflict. So the Rohingya issue is still there, still unresolved. In fact, because of the current political crisis in Myanmar, even more complex, even more difficult, more intense, more aggravated. And so, the original purposes of the UN, or the original reason for the UN, was that countries decided as the Second World War was coming to an end, that they wanted to try to establish a world order that would be more based on rules, on laws, on a respect for international law. And as the first paragraphs in the Charter of the United Nations talk about, ending the scourge of war. We're leaving future generations from the scourge of war. And the first thing to say about the modern world is the scourge of war is still there. It's not as, we've avoided a nuclear war. We've avoided a cataclysmic conflict on the level of the Second World War. But it's also true to say that we have seen extensive loss of life as a result of the severity of the conflict in a number of parts of the world. And the origin of those conflicts is, at least in part, as a result of politics, more broadly defined. And we have not, needless to say, been able to find a satisfactory solution to the fact that there is still political conflict in the world, and some of it is very intense, and that political conflict becomes military conflict, and it leads to loss of life and more serious issues. I guess there are three other issues that I want to touch on in my opening comments, and then I'm really very, very happy to answer your questions and get into a bit of a dialogue with you. The second is that we're at the moment experiencing a global pandemic. It's not the first global pandemic. It's not even the most serious. The most serious global pandemic we've had in recent years, I'd say recent, I mean in terms of modern history, was the influenza pandemic of 1919, 1920, 1921, so-called Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because it appeared there once and people said, well, we'll call it the Spanish flu, unfairly as it turns out. But Spanish flu killed 50 million people and had a devastating impact on a great many countries. Not I think at the time widely or sufficiently understood because of the nature of modern communication and also sense of what was the value of human life to everybody at the time. But one of the good things, and I would argue in the world today, is that we take human life more seriously than perhaps previous generations did. So we value and we count better than we used to count in those terrible days. The global pandemic is a feature of globalization. World War I and its aftermath increased the seriousness and the speed with which the virus spread. Soldiers in Europe would bring it back to North America, and then North America would take it back to Europe again as it went back and forth in subsequent waves. And when it finally got to Asia, by that time it had a devastating impact in India. In our case, we know that the pandemic, according to virtually all the expert reports that we have been produced since in the last 2 years, started in China, was not sufficiently contained in China before people began to realize that this could spread quickly. And as it spread, countries were slow to respond, and then finally began to respond more effectively, in particular with respect to the production of vaccines that would deal with it. But we now have a genuinely global pandemic. It's come in different waves. It has impact on health, life, the economy, and the social structures of the world. And what we now realize about the pandemic, I think emphatically, is the extent to which, while some countries have been relatively successful in vaccinating themselves, mainly wealthy countries, particularly Israel, but a number of other countries in terms of the relative success of being able to vaccinate everybody, the vaccine is not universally available. We have insufficient supplies of the vaccine to meet the global need and the global demand. We have a lot of issues around how would one quickly increase production, how quickly can we increase it, make sure it's widely shared. So you have a whole lot of issues around the issue of the vaccine, its availability. You also have, I think, an increasing recognition that the disease is lethal, that it's the death rate that can be attributed to the disease is actually much higher than the original statistics would lead you to believe. So instead of having a vaccine, a virus that we think may have killed 3.5 million people, recent studies are showing that it's probably closer to 10 to 12 million people who've been killed. But the health aspects of the vaccine are only a small part of the actual losses that are taking place, because what we're hearing, and I was just at a meeting this morning with a number of developing countries where we were getting firsthand reports from a number of people about the impact and how the impact has become even more serious as time goes on, that becomes more and more critical, that we begin to understand that it's the extent of the impact socially, economically, driving countries deeper into poverty, driving countries deeper into difficulty, increasing debt, reducing revenues, the things that make for a very bad and poor economy. Ironically, there are some countries that are already emerging economically from COVID, that are already recovering from it. So what the Western world has been able to do for itself in terms of vaccinating itself and also providing for benefits for the lowest paid people in the country, these are not being matched globally. So globally, we're seeing a retreat back to poverty. We're seeing a retreat back to people not being able to provide for themselves. And as a result, I think it can be well argued that increasingly can contribute to conflict. Many political theorists and philosophers over the years have pointed out that while scarcity in and of itself does not necessarily produce conflict, it can accelerate conflicts where there are already sources of tension and sources of difficulty, particularly when some groups seem to be doing better than others, when some groups are better equipped to deal with hardship than others. And so you get a lot of internal resentments and greater sources that can create the basis for conflict. Third factor that we have to look at in affecting, what is happening in the world today is climate change. And we know that climate change is, again, having a more serious impact than was perhaps appreciated 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, or certainly more widely understood that this is the case. And now we're increasingly seeing that the impact of the changes to the climate, which are steadily taking place and increasing in their impact, are having a dramatic effect on world population. For example, drought. Climate change isn't about what happens to the climate only. It's what happens to people as a result of what's happening to the climate. I think increasingly we have to understand that it's very much about people. It's not about climate. And so what happens to people? Well, first of all, when you have more catastrophic events, more hurricanes, more dramatic storms, you have immediately have an impact on places that are not able to respond effectively to a catastrophe. So to put it bluntly, in its simplest of terms, a hurricane in Florida has less impact than a hurricane in the Caribbean because the infrastructure is resilient, people are prepared, there's greater ability to respond. So the number of deaths that occur as a result of a hurricane in Florida is going to be much less dramatic than the impact that it will have in Cuba or in Puerto Rico or anywhere else in the Caribbean. And this is true throughout the world. So the inability of countries to create resilience, to create the ability to respond to catastrophe, flooding, extreme weather, and so on, drought, becomes more difficult. But not only in catastrophic events do we have to look at things, but we have to look at the impact of an increase. For example, I mentioned drought. That's really a longer term problem. Drought is not a 6-day event in which everybody's house is blown away. Drought is where I used to be able to plant seeds and grow. I can't do that anymore. Oh, and I don't have the infrastructure. I don't have the technology. I don't have the ability to harness small amounts of water that will allow plants to grow and things to thrive, trees to grow, and everything else. So we have to understand that this also becomes a significant impact on people. Some countries will literally disappear. There are 193 countries in the UN. 4 or 5 of them have only got about another 50 or max 75 years before they will literally disappear. They will become uninhabitable, and there won't be land there, on a year-round basis. And these are small countries. You might say, well, too bad, small, but they're countries, and it's reflective of the extent of the severity of the problem. And like the pandemic, climate change, those are two classic examples where the resolution to these issues has to be more global. The resolution to these issues cannot be, we'll fix it here. You don't fix climate change in one country. It can't be done. You can increase the ability of your country to face up to adapt to the impact of climate change, but you can't affect the overall issue. That issue can only be resolved by global action. And I think you have to say that so far the global response to climate change has been slow, inadequate, uneven, and ineffective. And we have to understand the consequence of that increasingly is that millions of people will suffer and will die as a result of the consequences of climate change over an extended period of time. Because for all of the conferences and for all of the targets, for all of the treaties that are signed, we don't see the speed of technological change dealing adequately with the extent of the crisis. And that's what makes it worse and worse. That's why it gets even more serious. Finally, the last thing I want to mention to you is the increasingly, there's two other things. The increasingly important issue of the digital divide. And then we'll get to broader issues that are raised by the issues of surveillance and the meaning and the impact, the force of what we call the fourth industrial revolution. The first impact of the industrial revolution is like the original industrial revolution, which started in England in the middle of the 18th century, is that it's very uneven. Some countries were able to industrialize very quickly. They took advantage of that situation. They increased their wealth. They increased their ability to produce, and were able to achieve greater degrees of control over their lives and greater degrees of domination globally. And in this fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing in its initial impact, just as the Industrial Revolution, in its initial impact, created much greater levels of inequality, greater levels of wealth, greater levels of poverty. We see the same thing happening with the digital divide today. We see the digital divide creating a situation where some people have access, you all have access to this technology. I'm speaking to you from a little room in my office in New York, and you're all watching wherever you're watching on your home screens all over the world. But there are many people that don't have access to this technology. They don't have access to this information, to this means of our talking to each other and increasing our level of knowledge and awareness. And if as this divide gets bigger, then resentments will only grow as well. You'll have another source of conflict, which will be the instability created by great gaps between rich and poor in single countries and more broadly around the world. And the last thing to sort of just to say with respect to the digital revolution is we need to understand that it is changing, in part, changing the nature of political discourse and changing the nature of politics and of communication, because it very, very much creates a situation where people are able to get access to what they think is information much more quickly in their pocket. But the problem is that much of what they have access to is not information. Well, that's the first problem. The second problem is that this little device of mine is not only where I receive information, but it's also where you receive information about me. So it doesn't take a whole lot of technological ingenuity for a receiver to become a microphone and for us to be watched all the time and subject to all kinds of intervention and control and dictatorship much more easily than before. So what we thought at the beginning of the digital revolution was going to be a new world of information and greater access for people, and more likely to produce freedom, more liberal values, more willingness to learn and to share. What we're actually seeing is that the first wave, or the first waves of the digital revolution, actually are in many cases waves of hatred, waves of extremism, and ways in which people can spread lies and propaganda and disinformation even more easily than you can spread information. So, you know, my machine produces, you know, liberal magazines and open sources of information, and somebody else's will produce, you know, hatred spewing out of some extremist force somewhere in the world, or even worse, somebody trying to hack into my method of communication and stealing information and stealing my identity and using that to destroy my life and destroy somebody else's life. So you really have to think about what the impact of this can be. And we're seeing now, in the age of digital diplomacy, how complicated it is and how easy it is for misinformation and for lies and for propaganda to spread, and how hard it is to find reliable sources of information, and how to ensure that instead of creating these silos of disinformation and walls of extremism, we might be able to create a more valid way of sharing information. But we're not there yet. And in fact, we're going in the other direction. So to sum up, I'm not giving you this talk to make you feel more gloomy. I'm giving you this talk to make you feel something of the challenges that we face in the modern world, and something about how I decided to, at a rather advanced age, to become a professional diplomat and to engage in diplomatic work. But in order to understand what diplomatic work can be, you need to understand the arena that we're in now. It's not the arena of the 19th century or the 20th century. It's a very new arena. Some things are constant. Some elements in human behavior, perhaps in how people act and how people think, might be relatively, you know, you can learn a lot from history in terms of understanding it. But some of what we need to understand are the sources of disruption in the world, as well as the sources of continuity. And I think right now we're in a world where there are more sources of disruption, and the impact these are having are very serious, very severe, and extremely consequential for world peace, for prosperity, and for the prospects of creating a better life for people, which is what I hope would be an objective we could all share. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to take your questions or comments. And if you could introduce yourselves and say where you're calling from or where you are, I can respond to your points. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador. So first off, yeah, your remarks, they really covered a wide variety of issues human rights issues, as well as all the global challenges facing the world, especially emerging from the pandemic. So while you were speaking, we had tons of questions pouring in from all over the world. So I'm going to start by asking one question. This is from Nicholas in Germany. And he asks, how do you explain Canada's success in soft power politics? Does Canada's minor military power in comparison to the United Nations Security Council veto nations positively or negatively affect the ability to pursue soft power politics?
Well, I mean, we pursue soft power because that's pretty much all we've got. I mean, relatively speaking, I mean, we have defense capabilities, we have military capabilities, but in the context of the United States, China, Russia, and the great powers, if you like, or the dominant military powers, we really don't have an ability to compete in that arena. So what we have to do, and what we do, and you hope that we can do it successfully, is really engage in seeking out like-minded countries, seeking out like-minded approaches, and trying to be as constructive and effective as we can in multilateral fora. And like a lot of middle powers or smaller powers, we depend on multilateral fora because they're the place where we can effectively grow because of we add new friends and we add new relationships. In some ways, it's sort of, when you think about Canada, it's kind of funny because we're geographically and politically, we are, I mean, count them out. We're the neighbor of the most powerful country in the world, the United States. And that we share a huge border with them, and we share an enormous economic relationship. So that's what we are. We're also an Arctic country. We're also an American country in the hemisphere. So we're a member of the OAS. We're partnered with many countries in the Americas on a whole range of issues where we can be very effective and partner. We're a Pacific country. We're an Atlantic country. We're a Commonwealth country. We're a Francophone country. We're a free trading country. So we are a country that depends extensively on our global networks. And because we're a relatively open country in terms of immigration, we have become a country in which the world, in effect, is in us. I mean, there are 193 countries in the United Nations. Every single one of them has a people living in Canada. And so we look at the world as perhaps differently from most other countries. That's who we are. And I think that helps us to build alliances and networks and support. And I think it helps us to be relative to our size of nearly 40 million people, a wealthy country. We're not tiny. Remember the G7, remember the G20. You go down the list of all the things that, we're like the most joining nation. And some people think it's a weakness, say, well, can't you decide who you are? You say, no, this is who we are. We're actually part of all these things.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to allow Mohammed to speak, unmute and speak and ask his question. Mohammed?
So, hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm 20 years old, and I study government and diplomacy strategies in IDC Herzliya. So, I don't know what to say. Good evening, good afternoon. But my question is, how do you think that artificial intelligence will improve the human rights policy? How it will affect it, for a good side or a bad side?
Sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of the question. How do I think that something will affect human rights?
The artificial intelligence, like the robots and all of this stuff.
Artificial intelligence. Well, that's a very good question. I think it makes things complicated. Because in our world, if you think about it, artificial intelligence can be used by authoritarian countries to increase the ability to create a surveillance society. And in creating a surveillance society, they're able to increasingly control human activity. And at the same time, in the world of modern capitalism, we're entering into the world of what Professor Shusov calls surveillance capitalism, where in fact we think that we like to think that I use Google, but actually Google uses me. I don't control Google. Suddenly, if I look for a book, my phone pops up and says, well, here's a bunch of other books. So you sort of say, well, wait a minute, I didn't ask for those books. I don't want to be your friend. I just want to use the information that you have. I don't want to become your buddy. I just want you to help me out here. But we don't get to choose that easily. And it's very difficult to restrict the ability of the networks that have been created to our ability to control them as opposed to their controlling us. And I think we're wrestling with this all the time. We see this with respect to something like, when I did my work on the Rohingya at the beginning, I had to come to terms with the fact that the internet had a horrific effect on the spread of hatred in Myanmar after the country was opened up to the internet, because it wasn't the spread of liberal ideas or thoughtful ideas, it was the spread of hatred that became the instrument of choice of the military in Myanmar. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to ask a question. This is from Doreen from Kenya. And he asks, what advice can the ambassador give to entry-level diplomats in terms of skills and mindset, and especially to those who have an interest in humanitarian diplomacy?
Well, the first thing is humility. That is a lot to learn, and you can learn a lot from other people. The second thing is always maintaining a sense of curiosity and an interest in other people, an ability to ask questions to other people, an ability to engage with others and find out, what they're thinking, a curiosity about other cultures, a willingness to learn languages. If I had to do my life over again, which I won't have, I would say that I regret that at a certain point in my life, I was not able to really apply myself to learning more languages. I've learned a few, but the more you can keep in your head, the better off you are. And also because learning another language, you learn another culture, you learn another way of thinking. You develop yourself differently. And again, I come back to the first idea, which really is humility. I think the less you have the imperial instinct in your soul, the better off you are. The more you see yourself as and feel yourself to be part of a wider humanity that is growing and bubbling and changing all the time, the better off you are. If you're trying to dominate, or you're trying to outdo other people, or you're trying to outperform others, the more narcissistic you are, the worse off you are as a diplomat, as an effective person, and as a humanitarian, particularly if you're interested in humanitarian diplomacy. So those would be a few of my ideas that I hope are helpful to you. And good luck with whatever you decide to do.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to call on Amit Baran to ask his question. Amit, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Trenton, for the opportunity. First, Ambassador, I would like to say thank you for the lecture. I had many takeaways. I'm Amit, I'm from Israel, and I'm IDI's representative in the United States. My question is, you were referring to technology in digital era. Can you collaborate about your interpretation about effective modern or future diplomacy?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, it's very hard for me to predict. You know, the good thing about the future is you can't predict it. I don't know. The one thing I think we know is that there's a lot that's happening that's beyond our capabilities to understand today. And we know that will be true. If we'd been meeting 20 years ago, none of us, or 25 years ago, none of us would have predicted the internet. I mean, it would have said, well, I don't know, if somebody said, well, you're going to have this, and then you're going to have that, you're going to have this, people would have said, whoa, I don't believe it. But it can all happen really quickly. And I think we're living in a time when, in an age of such innovation, there will be more innovations, there will be more developments. But having said that, I think that we've got to go back and think about, well, then what can we, what can we do? And I think we have to think through carefully the importance of some of the enduring features of human nature. And here we go to things like empathy. How able are we to continue to maintain our empathy in the face of what we see and hear, or don't see and don't hear? How able are we to think consequentially? I think more and more, as I watch things in the world today and think of my own, situation and think how I've reacted to events, I think the more we act impulsively, the worse off we are. And I think a great deal of what we're trying to do in modern diplomacy is get people to think consequentially. So when you're dealing with a conflict, you have to ask yourself, yes, I know how you feel as a result of what's just happened to you. I know what you have internalized as a result of that. The question is, what is the consequence of what you are going to do? And I think that's a much harder question. So the technology will increase our ability to communicate more quickly, but will it increase our ability to communicate more wisely? Sometimes I wonder. I mean, I know that in my political lifetime, politicians have gone from saying, well, it's a week, I've got time to respond, I can think about what I'm going to say, I can handle it. But now in the news cycle is 24/7, it's going all the time, constantly. I'm getting Twitter messages from journalists saying, what's your reaction to what just happened in Belarus? And it's sometimes you say, well, I can't give you an instant reaction. I don't like what's happened. It's terrible, but let me find out more information. Sometimes that's not an acceptable answer. People are saying, well, let's go, let's quickly. I need your clip for my next news hour. So feed me my clip. Well, my reaction is to say, it's not my job to feed you. My job is to try to respond wisely and where I think it's going to be a positive and constructive way to respond. So I think it's fair to say that it in many respects will make things more complicated. Technology will not instantly solve our problems. And I think we've made the mistake sometimes of worshiping at that altar of thinking, well, the technology will produce an instant solution. Not always.
Thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to take a pivot. This is a question from Ray from Ottawa. And he asks, Canada was rejected twice at the Security Council in the United Nations. How will this Canadian foreign policy failure be remedied? Is there a plan? Thank you.
Well, I mean, let's put it in perspective. First of all, the UN is 193 countries, of whom 15 are on the Security Council. There are 2 seats every 2 years from the group that we're in, which is called WEOG, Western Europe, and others, and that's a pretty diverse group of countries, and we. In the beginning of the UN, we would usually get elected about once every 10 years or so, but we have not been elected since 2000, I guess you'd say. And I regret that, obviously, but I do not believe it's fatal to our diplomacy. The Security Council, of all the institutions of the UN and of the wider UN system, I think you'd have to say it's one of the most dysfunctional. So, you know, you get a 2-year term, but sometimes I wonder whether it's a 2-year term or a 2-year sentence, because you're going around like, you know, on a wheel for 24 hours all the time on the Security Council, not necessarily with the countries have the veto, the 5 countries with the veto. You know, the chances of really being able to be productive in that particular way may not be as effective as you think. So Canada's made, I think, the right decision, which is to say, we're going to take a while to think about, you know, how we want to work on the UN institutions, looking at UNDP, looking at the UN economically, looking at how we respond to COVID, where we've been very effective. We've co-chaired with Jamaica a really brilliant group of countries coming together and have put the United Nations system at the heart of the response to COVID, not only in health terms, but also economically and socially. And we've helped to do that. I mean, Canada has been instrumental in making that happen. So there's some very positive things we can still do. The fact is, there won't be an opening for us in the Security Council for some years to come, and we need to understand that it may not be the only place where we can have an impact or have an effect at the UN.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. And now I'd like to call on Stav. So Stav, if you could please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, good evening. So first of all, thank you. It was an extremely interesting lecture. I'm actually a government and sustainability student, and I'm a part of the II. So I was very curious to hear about you talking about climate change, and I'm wondering, as a representative of Canada, what's the level of responsibility or the actions that you think that developed countries should get from countries like Canada, like the UN, like how can we help them get to the same level of preparedness to the climate change as we are?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think all of us that are producing GHGs, I mean, greenhouse gases, I think all of us have a responsibility. Canada's probably we're per capita, we're quite a large emitter, but because our population is relatively small compared to China or the United States or other countries, we're a relatively small emitter, but that doesn't take away our moral responsibility from being part of the effort to reduce emissions. The other thing I think we have to focus on is there's 2 aspects to the policy framework to deal with climate change. One is the mitigation, the reduction in GHGs, and the industrial transformation that is required to get to the reasonable targets that have been set for 2030 and 2050. So we have a role to play in that. But the other is in terms of finance. COVID-19 has had a dramatic effect on the public finances of a number of developing countries. But the real situation in Africa, in many parts of Asia, and in the Pacific Islands and so on, the real issue is, well, where these countries do not produce a lot of emissions, and yet they are, in many cases, the most hard hit as a result of the existing impacts of climate change. Not what do we think climate change is going to do in 30 years. It's what climate change is doing right now. And that's where we have to look at climate finance. How do we finance better infrastructure? How do we increase training? And some countries have done remarkably well. I mentioned Bangladesh, which is the home country to the Rohingya. Bangladesh has done remarkably well in reducing the number of fatalities as a result of cyclones. And they've done it by being very systematic about early warning systems, improving the level of education of people about how they can better protect themselves when storms are coming, building effective storm shelters. And it's these relatively kind of practical ideas have already done a lot to save lives. And so that's a kind of thing where we need to look at increasing the level of support for what we call climate adaptation as opposed to climate mitigation. And generally speaking, the Western world has been slow in providing for the financial needs of those countries that really want to try to build greater resilience in the face of what is already an existing problem. I've got about another 2 or 3 minutes and then I have to go. So, because I've got to get on to another meeting at 3 o'clock. So.
Okay, so this will be the last question, Ambassador. This is from Dr. Sahar in Pakistan. And he asks, would you be able to comment on Western humanitarian diplomacy and vaccine nationalism? Are these not contradictory practices?
Totally. Absolutely contradictory. The failure of the Western countries to adequately respond to the crisis of need of developing countries in terms of the vaccine is a critical issue. And I deplore vaccine nationalism. I think it's essential that we share the vaccine. I think it's essential that we share the means of getting to the vaccine, that we do everything we can to facilitate its distribution, to increase its production. I think we're making some progress in this area, but the progress is still slow. So your point, the point of your question is completely understood and well received. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. And now we just want to do a quick photo because I know you have to run. So if everyone could turn on their cameras real quick, I'll give you about 30 seconds to turn on your camera. Okay. All right, just a few more. And Ambassador, just so you know, we had over 170 people register and they represent over 30 countries in the world, every single continent except Antarctica. So it's quite a diverse group of participants here today.
I try to get those Antarcticans on and they just don't accept my invitation. I don't know what's wrong with them.
Maybe next time. All right, everyone, 3, 2, 1. All right, and then one more. 3, 2, 1. Great. Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador.
Good. You can follow me on @BobRae48 on Twitter.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
you can get going to your meeting. So thank you very much.